So I have the slightly unenviable task of trying to extract some themes from a day of extraordinary richness, of diversity, both of subject matter and approach, and to then try and weave this together into thinking about some of the key themes of the day. And as Charles mentioned to me, as I slipped my PowerPoint into the shared file about an hour ago, there's an element of last minute, but that's deliberate because I wanted to try and capture some of the emerging themes from the conversation today. But before we get started, I wanted to think a little bit more, perhaps, about some of the context within which we might be operating. And I suppose in particular what I'm thinking about here is this kind of enhanced sense of ethno-nationalism that seems to be ever increasing in our popular and political discourse. And I guess to perhaps encourage us today to think about the role that country houses might play in finding an alternative route through this. So two things on the screen here. On the left is the village Facebook group for the nearby village to where I live in West Sussex, the Pulborough Village group, where Jez says, there seems to be the start of a little bit of British pride surfacing. Dare I mention that I think it would be great if Pulborough Village Council started putting up the St George Cross or Union flag up on the lampposts in the village. And I'm acutely conscious there are many colleagues in the room today that have direct lived experience of what it means to be surrounded by and draped in particular types of flags. And those of us in the southeast of England are only just catching up with what that might make us feel like. And I think the sense that this sense of division, this sense of there being two parallel truths that have no points of union, no point of connection in the middle, feels really palpable for the first time in my life in the home counties. And the feeling of driving through Pulborough with those union flags hanging from the lamppost doesn't exactly feel welcoming or indeed encouraging. But I have to praise the words of anonymous participant 453, who finishes by saying, I know many people in Britain, in Pulborough, who are British, but would fly a flag from their overseas heritage. It would be a nice way to bring community together. And that takes me through to the image on the right of your screen. David Goodhard's 2017 bestseller, The Road to Somewhere, which was immortalised in Theresa May's post-Brexit speech at the Conservative Party conference, where she said, if you are a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere. Now, I think this is the context within which we are operating, a context within which nationalism, national identity, and a sense of what it means to be British is really, or any nation, is being debated and considered and articulated perhaps more forcefully, certainly than I've experienced it. And I feel, what Goodhart, he conceives there being two types of people, the anywheres and the somewheres. The anywheres are that highly educated, mobile, global elite who are just as happy in the Terminal 5 business lounge at Heathrow as they are on the west coast of the USA or out in Hong Kong. Whereas the somewheres are the left behinds, those individuals who've grown up in towns where the economic base has fallen out due to the shorthand, globalization, and various other forms of capital perpetuated by a global elite. So what does this have to do with country houses? I feel what it does is it frames the very live debates that we exist within. And it also frames the urgency of finding a new role and a new purpose to country houses over the coming generation. And I'm aware that I speak from the position of a museum, the V&A, that in 1974 did more perhaps than many other institutions to define the Britishness of the country house. in that exhibition, The Destruction of the Country House, it was a crime against your sense of identity if, as a Briton, you did not shed a tear that some of these houses had been destroyed, that some of these houses had passed out of aristocratic ownership. And I think, we're at a prime time for revisiting that. And I suppose what I've been so intrigued by over the course of the day are the ways in which there are a series of themes and perhaps binaries that have been emerging, and the ways in which colleagues in the room have so skillfully navigated between those binary choices to suggest an alternative way through the challenges ahead. So, of course, that idea of anywhere or somewhere. And I think the country house is a really brilliant way for us to explore those global the globally entwined nature of this country over the longue durée. That idea of the local versus the global, perhaps also the public versus the private, and now as many of these houses are explicitly in public ownership, what changes does that necessitate in the way in which we might discuss, describe, and share the histories of these sites with as wide a range of people as possible? Also thrillingly, and I think brilliantly illuminated by the Gardens, I hate to describe it as the Gardens panel, let's call it the Plant Humanities panel earlier today, colleagues over here, the ways in which the potential and the potentialities of the landscape and the way in which the landscape bleeds into and interrelates with the interiors was so fascinatingly explored. And yeah, with your point about the native versus the exotic, and I thought that was such a brilliant paper because also what you forced us to think about is to historicize our language use and descriptors, to really think about the ways in which our subjects are articulating their experience of the world and not necessarily just layering on our linguistic choices onto what was going on in the past. I was intrigued by the idea of the kind of kin-based versus the bureaucratic way of navigating empire. I want to return to some of these key themes just at the end of my remarks. But before I do that, I want to give you a bit of a sense of where I'm coming from by sharing some of the findings from a recently concluded project that was funded by the British Academy, which sought to address a strategic innovation challenge. We were asking how to transform the country house visitor experience from passive consumption behind roped areas to active engagement with these dynamic and inspiring historical spaces and collections. And working in partnership with the National Trust, and in particular with Dr. Tanya Cooper, who was Curatorial and Collections Director, but now, thanks to the restructure, has been retitled something else, which I can't remember. But we worked together and we suggested that there were perhaps two interlocking questions which have been tested and probed throughout the papers delivered today. Firstly, how can heritage organisations shift from explaining and interpreting the amalgam of material evidence of what is left to what is meaningful and significant? I'd suggest that the future of our properties is probably less in the detritus of aristocratic life and more in extracting those meaningful and pertinent and revelatory objects that can help us explore a much wider range of histories. And I suppose that relates to the second question that we are interested in exploring, is what are the research and knowledge exchange mechanisms, this is a British Academy grant, you have to write like that, sorry, required to enable broader intellectual and public access to country houses and ensure public benefit. And I've been conducting this research at a moment of kind of transformation in my own personal life, with visiting country houses with my own children for the first time. So throughout, you will see my son Gabriel featuring as the star of the show. And I think that has really recalibrated, I know it sounds such a trite thing to say, but it's really recalibrated the way in which I think and feel about these spaces. what it means to see these spaces through the eyes of a 2-year-old through to he's 4.5 now has been really intriguing. And then I've also been conscious of the kinds of behaviour that I want to model in these spaces. It's one of respect, but not one of deference, crucially, and especially in those properties that are owned by charitable organisations like the National Trust. These are de facto public property. So I think it's about empowering that next generation to feel comfortable in these spaces, to be able to, if he wants, lie down on the floor and look up at the ceiling. You know, what's the worst that could happen? So what we would, through the research project, what we sought to do was address what we saw as some of the fundamental issues in the ways that visitors intellectually and physically access historic interiors and historic collections. From the passivity of most visits to country houses, being behind ropes and viewing platforms, looking but not touching, being spoken to rather than engaged with, through to the challenges facing curators and heritage professionals in communicating layered and multiple significances in situ, often without those tools used elsewhere in the sector. Object labels, anyone? Let's use them. Why not? We can. And I suppose what we were trying to argue, I mean, what we'd set up was this argument that basically stuff hasn't changed from the 50s. And I know that's not strictly true, but we needed to kind of exaggerate our point to get the money. But one thing that I think has been a through line from the 50s onwards is the extent to which we often struggle to move away from solely sharing the lives and loves of the heteronormative dynastic family, despite the significant innovations in the academic research landscape that continue to reconceptualize the country house as a nodal point in local, national, and international histories. Major changes in visitor demographics and expectations as country houses have become part of the experience economy, as well as those enormous potentials presented by developments in augmented and mixed reality technologies. So we felt that there was a bit of a dissonance between the academic and curatorial emphasis on animating spaces based on that understanding as illuminated so brilliantly by so many of the papers today, that country houses are environments that are always evolving, driven by fluid interactions between people, object, and place, and that ongoing and still sadly dominant public perception that sees country houses as ossified sites with little contemporary relevance. And I think what we discovered perhaps rhymes and resonates with what we've been discussing today. And perhaps the most important part of this work was us zeroing in on the key importance of public benefit, rooted in the National Trust's core purpose as enshrined in many acts of Parliament. And delivering maximum public benefit became a way of organising our thoughts and linking across the various and, dare I say it, occasionally disparate parts of the project. And I suppose what we realised during the course of this work is that we're trying to advance, and I'm keen to share this idea with you today for robust critique. Like, that's the great thing about us all being here today, is to collectively we're helping to raise the tide, as it were. Is this idea of the public country house. So Gabriel really embodying what it means to exist in a public country house there as he makes himself at home. But a once privately owned country house built for private enjoyment, now in the ownership of public bodies and charities established for national public benefit. And that idea of the public country house and the idea and the emphasis on national public benefit catalyzes a conversation about purpose. Should heritage organisations and museums act as custodians of the material past fixed at a particular moment in time? Or should we function as champions for a wider shared understanding of our national past and use our material and historical assets as a means of achieving this. I think you've got a sense which way I think we should go on that. And I want to re-stress this point about purpose. Both Tanya, Cooper, my collaborator, and I, we really believe that the public country house is a distinctive proposition within the UK heritage landscape. But more significantly, it determines the core purpose of the property in question. Owning a country house on behalf of the nations you serve, in the case of the National Trust for England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and of course our colleagues in the National Trust of Scotland, or for a local community, so those houses that are now part of local or regional museum services, creates different duties and expectations than for those remaining in private hands. And I'm not really interested in the discussion about whether public versus private ownership is better. I think we can tie ourselves in knots with that, and it's frankly dull. I think we can celebrate the fact that we have a mixed tapestry of ownership models within the UK. That if you want that family house experience, members of the Historic Houses Association can do that with a level of authenticity that other heritage organisations might struggle with. So I think rather what we want to think about is that for those public houses, how could we unlock and achieve maximum public benefit? And how might we get there? So we've got three factors that we think come into play. And I think these really align with so many of the remarks that have been made in the room today. This is my second son, Jasper, here, really getting a sense of the triumph of the Duchess of Somerset at Petworth, which, for all 10-month-year-olds is really important to kind of get that, get that sense of aspiration, right? As I say, we've been trying to think about these three factors. The first of which is this idea of harnessing public purpose and a public mandate. And recent audience research suggests that there is a public mandate for heritage organisations to generate and share broad and deep histories to support public understanding. Recent audience research focused upon National Trust members indicated that of the around 8 million visits to NT historic houses annually, what motivates about 90% of these visits into the house. So I totally take the point that Pam made earlier about the landscape versus, and Jessica made about house versus landscape earlier. The primary motivating factor for 90% of these visits is a desire to learn. And that most audiences want access to simple, easily accessible, and historically accurate interpretation. And I think those audience needs differ pretty substantially from a baseline admiration of a nice pile of bricks and a cup of tea, and indicate that we might actually be underplaying our audience's both interest in and capacity to discern the fact that multiple historical truths can exist at the same time and in the same place, and that our audiences are able to navigate those challenges that we as professional historians are also equipped to do. I think the second point is around patterns of obligation. And I think this idea of the public mandate for evolution comes at a moment where the traditional patterns of obligation that define relationships within the country house are changing. The National Trust, as the largest national heritage organisation in the UK, has both a remit and an obligation to its various audiences to promote the relevant plural histories of its places. And in many cases, what this will mean is an additional layer of research and interpretation that, as I say, moves beyond that kind of core inherited narrative to highlight previously marginalized or overlooked histories. And of course, these opportunities for interpretation are potentially limitless and could effectively harness that ever-expanding galaxy of current research activity that uses the country house as a starting point. And I suppose it's interesting to think back, and I was saying this to Kate earlier, that we're almost approaching the 10-year anniversary of the East India Company at home. And it's extraordinary to think what has happened in the last decade in terms of the absolute explosion in new research around the country house, new projects that are both nationally focused and sort of deeply conscious of the international connections too. And so I suppose the identification of a range of plural narratives therefore depends upon this second factor for the evolution to increase public benefit. It's a willingness to identify and question patterns of obligation that either implicitly or explicitly impact upon the perceived freedom of action or otherwise of staff, volunteers, and researchers at historic sites. The inherited narrative and presentation of interiors set at the time of acquisition from the 1930s to the 2000s can become cemented as the ideal of authenticity that cannot evolve, even when that narrative was set by or reinvented by past curators and modelled by tenants and owners to meet the needs of the audiences for that particular period. So I think what I'm suggesting is that we need to be confident in identifying what are those barriers at a property level or at an institutional level that might be holding us back from making those important changes. And then finally, as we summit the mountain of opportunity here, as Gabriel is so nobly doing, I think the third factor for evolution of increased public access is rooted in the diverse skills of an expanded cohort of heritage professionals and volunteers who want to come with us on this journey, on this opportunity, and feel that sense of obligation to existing and future audiences to provide an enjoyable visit that enhances a sense of discovery and understanding. And this is an ongoing shift already well underway in most heritage organisations, from a custodial role with obligations to the material past, to also acting as an inclusive platform for the generation of new forms of knowledge, and as an interpreter, promoter, and marketeer of history, thereby stepping into the space of public histories that is going to be absolutely key to enabling broader value. And I think crucial in this change will be ongoing collaboration, as modelled by the project that we're all here to celebrate today. Organisations such as Historic Royal Palaces, English Heritage, and the National Trust have played a really significant role hosting collaborative PhD projects over, it's the 20th anniversary of collaborative PhDs funded by the AHRC this year, the birthday party you never knew you wanted to come to. But I think what's really significant is that across that scheme, and just, thinking about since the National Trust became an independent research organisation about 5 to 6 years ago, more than 2.5 million words have been written by early career researchers about National Trust sites and collections through this particular funding scheme. We know more than ever before about the country house, but what we are struggling with, I would contend, is that next step, that the funding system prioritises the production of the PhD and does not fund the transformation of that new knowledge into meaningful and actionable resources for thinly stretched property teams. So I think collectively, I feel in this room we have people of enough seniority around the table to really advocate for a new form of funding that is seeking to enable that translation or that collaborative research to really turn that raw material into something that can engage and inspire visitors. I think there are a few, future research questions that we might want to think about. But before we do that, I just wanted to reflect on perhaps the biggest challenge facing us at the moment, is that whilst we know that this work is of ethical and moral importance, that we need to share a wider range of stories rooted in the material and historical assets of these sites with as wide a range of people as possible, we are doing this in a climate of fiscal restraint and resource scarcity. And that's obviously management speak for horrendous job losses across the sector. And, I'm deeply conscious that my main collaborator, Tanya, the reason we're delayed in our publication of some of the findings of this is Tanya's had to lead a major restructure at the National Trust over the last 6 to 8 months. And even at the V&A, we're going into our next round of financial planning and budget setting for 2026-27 on the understanding that cash is king. Efforts and activity that drive revenue will win out when the museum's executive board meets. So I think that is the greatest challenge we continue to face. We know that the work we've discussed today and discussed by the many brilliant speakers is urgent. We know that it's a moral and ethical imperative, but I still don't think we've quite won the argument that it's budget enhancing or at the very least cost neutral. And I think all of the work going on with this project in particular, the choice modelling, is really, really exciting for us because it's trying to answer that kind of question, which is when it comes to the Finance and Audit Committee, can we demonstrate the fact that this work brings new revenue streams and new visitors to our sites? Because the likelihood of more funding from local, regional or national governments is remote. There might be an occasional windfall from a Treasury rounding error, but that is not a solid foundation to chart a future trajectory from. And I think we also need to be mindful of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The beauty and craftsmanship of these places and spaces, both within the house and in the landscape, remains an endorphin hit. And my wife, who's curator of Petworth House for the National Trust, has a saying which I've stolen with pride. She wants Petworth under her care to look good and be better understood. So, by way of conclusion then, I think today's conference prompts many more questions, of which I might suggest we zero in on 4 in particular. Firstly, what obligations do the owners of historic houses have to share broad and deep histories of place, which are now on the fault lines of public history? What are the challenges and some of the solutions for addressing the selectivity, partiality, and conscious amnesia in the telling and sharing of histories through the heritage product of the country house? And does the thing that we all know, that the country house changes and has consistently changed over time, can that give us the confidence that it will continue to evolve into the future? And finally, how do we do this work in a way that meets our audiences where they are, rather than where we would like them to be? And I think that's a particularly challenging thing to do. So in the final minute or so available to me, I'd like to suggest that perhaps the way through all of this is for us to be hyper-specific, to go back to that phrase we heard earlier, the spirit of place. And actually what studying the country house enables us to do is to be deeply, deeply rooted in place. That if we focus in on the particularities, the significance and the importance of an individual place and the way in which a pebble drop there ricochets out across global flows and entanglements, that perhaps gives us an opportunity or a way or a methodology of charting our course through these complicated moments. And in this process, I commend to you the work of 2 friends and colleagues. The first is this unbelievable work of local place-based history written by Alexandra Harris, who's here at the University of Birmingham. Alex writes a micro-history of 10 square miles of West Sussex. It weirdly happens to be exactly where I live now as well. And what she weaves is a story that, whilst rooted in those 10 square miles of sort of English countryside, reaches is transmitted out to the furthest reaches of the globe. She has this extraordinary chapter on the ways in which a sort of, should we call it, an encouraged emigration scheme led by the Earls of Egremont in the early 19th century that encouraged tenants to head out to rural Canada. The ways in which the Canadian wilderness was understood and conceived through the local lens of West Sussex, the way in which distances were measured according to how far it was from Storrington to Pulborough. I think what that does is it highlights that power of distinctiveness, that power of place, and the ways in which that has many, many different types of connections. And then the final piece of work I really want to commend to you is currently being undertaken by a colleague of mine at the V&A, Dr. Tupton Kelsang. And Tupton is a remarkable scholar in lots of ways. And when we appointed him at the V&A, he challenged all sorts of AHRC residency requirements because Tupton is a stateless refugee. And the AHRC didn't have a box for stateless refugee, which was intriguing in itself. Tupton's a scholar of Tibetan culture. And what Tupton's been working with the V&A on is to help us really think in a much slower, more precise way about what it means to do community collaboration. And one of the things that Tupton points out is, as I say here, that there are divergent actors and groups that will emerge to compete for the role of representing a community of origin. So I think as we go into that important and that necessary work of deeper collaboration with the range of individuals and communities that intersect and interact with our sites, I think we also need to remember to take our time and to do that work slowly and with intention and with care. And Tupton's evolving methodology is a way to do it. Thanks so much for your time, everyone. It's been really lovely to share this with you. Cheers.